Pureblood Pretense by Murkybluematter. Chapter 3. It was the third time Draco Malfoy levelled his gaze at Rigel Black, and still the boy remained unaware. It wasn't just any gaze either. It was the one his father had taught him, the weighty one, meant to be felt across ballrooms. If Draco hadn't known the black air was raised by blood traitors before, it would have been made obvious by the boy's sheer obliviousness. No child raised in a proper pure blood house would have been able to sleep through such pointed scrutiny, and each moment he stared, getting not so much as a twitch from the other boy, brought fresh annoyance to Draco's mood. He was supposed to write a letter to his mother this morning about the sorting, and particularly about the black air, but how was he to do that when he had nothing to say? He'd walked the train a couple of times before it left the station, but hadn't seen anyone who looked like the picture of young Sirius Black from his mother's family tree. He had thought he would be able to meet Black at some point before the sorting, or at the very least during dinner if he was sorted into Slytherin as his mother had hoped. But although he'd initiated contact, a judicious head nod in greeting, and given him plenty of impetus to speak to him, blatant staring at dinner, the dark-haired boy hadn't reacted to his presence at all. And when they ended up in the same room, he'd been certain Black would introduce himself like any proper pureblood. Not certainly remembered his manners, but Black went straight to sleep. All in all, Draco mused, the other boy was plain irksome, entirely undeserving of his mother's misguided instruction to befriend him. Related or not, he wasn't anything resembling company befitting a Malfoy. Finally, at sunrise, Rigel Black began to stir. Draco would have loved to take credit for that, but it appeared the other boy was used to awakening at such a time, for he looked neither confused nor surprised when he glanced at the watch on his bedside table. Draco thought his father would be proud of him for the patience he showed waiting for Black to notice him. He may as well have been waiting for Goyle to find his way to the end of a sentence, however, for Rigel Black had less self-awareness than his father's peacocks. The boy got out of bed and stretched, never once looking around. Draco's short supply of patience ran out when Black started to pick out his clothes for the day, and he cleared his throat with a practised decorum only a Malfoy could have held on to so early in the day. That got his attention, Draco thought exasperatedly, as Black paused, bent over his trunk. How did this airhead get into Slytherin? Going somewhere? He said out loud. Black slung a towel over his shoulder and held up a brush in one hand. Yeah, he said, shutting his trunk. With a bundle of clean clothes, Draco winced at the callous wrinkling of perfectly good robes. Black strode to the door of their bathroom, stepping inside and shutting it behind him. Draco heard the distinct click of the lock and huffed grumpily. "Well, good morning to you, too," he muttered, flinging himself from the bed to the standing wardrobe where he'd unpacked and stored all of his robes the night before, like any normal person. Forget the promise he made to his mother. No vague inkling of a familial alliance in the future was worth it if that was how Rigel Black was going to be all the time. By the time Draco had brushed out his robes and combed back his hair, and therefore regained his dignity, he had calmed down a little. 1 week, thought Draco. I'll be friendly, and, Merlin forbid, slightly solicitous for 1 week. After that, if Black is still a reticent little nobody, even Mother can't blame me for moving on to more suitable acquaintanceships. Rigel leaned shakily against the closed bathroom door. She didn't think she'd ever been stared at so much in her life. What did Malfoy want, a picture? She had retreated to the bathroom to get out from under his heavy gaze. The boy had a glare like a hammer, but a quick look in the mirror showed nothing unusual. No green hair or fangs or subtle suggestion that she wasn't a boy. In short, nothing that would merit such intense scrutiny. Shivering with a feeling of vague foreboding, she checked the lock on the door again and got undressed and into the shower. She was still getting used to how little time she had to spend getting ready in the morning without long hair to deal with, so she'd have to find something to do in the mornings if she didn't start waking up later. Come to think of it, what was the Malfoy boy doing up so early, besides drilling holes into the back of people's heads with his eyes? By the time she dried her hair and dressed, she'd decided it was none of her business. As she re-entered the dorm room, she was met with a blindingly cheerful smile and a "good morning" from Nott, who was apparently just as bad in the mornings as Archie, all sunshine and bluebirds. He was waiting, with tousled brown hair and a toothbrush in one hand. "Finished?" "Yes." she said, moving out of the doorway. "Did I wake you with the shower?" "Nope." He tossed a grin at her as he brushed past. "It was Draco with his Malfoy stare of death." Not sure what to say to that. She merely nodded and continued to her bed, which was between Knott's and Malfoy's, where she hung her towel over the silver canopy to dry. She saw Malfoy's narrow-eyed look out in her periphery, but ignored him, thinking he probably had never reused a towel in his life, and was wondering why she would hang it up instead of dumping it in the hamper for the elves. She was forced to rethink her conclusion when he intercepted her on her way to the door. "I don't think we've been properly introduced," he said. "I'm Draco Malfoy." "Rigel Black," she said. "Pleased to meet you." "Are you going to breakfast already?" he asked politely, a friendly smile on his face, as if he hadn't just leapt in front of her to formally introduce himself. "It doesn't start for another 20 minutes, I don't think." "Unless you have a map of the school, it may take that long for me to find my way," she said, stepping pointedly around him. She knew it was rude beyond belief, but the one thing she didn't need, the one thing that could ruin everything, was attention from the wrong kind of people. And if Malfoy didn't qualify as wrong, she'd eat her potion's ingredients. "You could ask an older student," he pointed out to her back. The lack of irritation or censure in his voice impressed her enough that she turned around to face him once more. "I doubt they're headed to breakfast this early," she said, feeling every so slightly vindicated when she saw his eyes flash and his lip protrude a tiny bit before the polite smile could distract from it. There was the spoiled child she'd expected of the Malfoy scion, who pouted, however briefly, when things didn't fall into their place at his feet. "They would be in 20 minutes when it starts," he said slowly, his overly patient tone that of someone explaining something he shouldn't have to. "You're probably right." She offered him the tiniest of smiles, barely more than a crinkle, and proceeded to turn around and open the door to the corridor. "Good morning, Malfoy." She allowed herself another smile, this one genuine, at the imagined look on his face as she shut the door firmly behind her. The common room was indeed deserted, even though they had to finish breakfast 30 minutes early in order to meet with their head of house that morning. There wasn't any reason for students to be about before the elves had even begun serving it, so Rigel enjoyed the silence as she crossed to the common room entrance. Faced with the blank wall, she realized she didn't know how to open it from the inside. "Ouroboros," she guessed, pleasantly surprised when the wall slid to the side silently. It actually made good sense, she thought, as it closed just as quietly behind her. This way, you wouldn't be able to leave the common room without knowing the password to get back in, making it less likely that someone would be caught outside in the cold dungeon air all night. When she had walked far enough to be out of the immediate sight of the common room entrance, she pulled out a deceptively blank piece of parchment. Archie gave it to her shortly after Sirius had given it to him. James and Sirius had told Archie what it was, reminiscing about the time Filch confiscated it from them before impressing on him exactly how important it was that it never fall into prefect or professor hands. Apparently they'd claimed it as their property a few years after graduation, without ever admitting to the old caretaker what it was. With the Marauders' map in hand, she traversed the dungeons carefully. All the corridors looked the same, but with a bird's-eye view, the pattern was a little easier to understand. Her feet would remember better than her eyes did, however, so she walked as many of them as she could before 20 minutes had passed. After making certain she could find the potions classroom, she made a beeline for the staircase that would take her back up to the entrance hall, and from there to the Great Hall. She wiped the parchment clean and tucked it away as she started to ascend the stairs, and was halfway up when a voice called out from behind her. She glanced over her shoulder to see Nott hurrying up the staircase to catch up with her, Malfoy and an older Slytherin following at a more sedate pace. "Are you just now going up?" Nott asked incredulously. "You left ages ago." "The dungeons are extensive," she said, as the slower two joined them. "You've been lost all this time?" The older Slytherin, an athletic-looking boy with warm brown hair and eyes, asked with amusement. "It's not as if I had a map," she said, straight-faced. "No better way to learn than to get lost, they say." The boy led the way into the great hall. "I'm Adrian Pusey." She inclined her head absently. "Rigel Black." Pusey frowned as they found seats near the middle of the Slytherin table. "Forgive me, but I had thought it was Arcturus Black." "Rigel is my middle name," she said, noting as she poured herself a glass of milk that her roommates were listening attentively. Knott and Pusey exchanged a confused glance when she started eating a bowl of porridge, and they realized that was going to leave it at that. She thought Malfoy's eyebrow might have twitched before he turned to his eggs. Rigel has just finished eating when Pansy walked into the hall. She came to stand behind Knott, who was seated to Rigel's left, and cleared her throat delicately. The lanky boy immediately moved down a bit, crowding the boy on his left to allow Pansy room to sit. She nodded like a queen who had just received a bow from one of her courtiers, and greeted Rigel somewhat coolly. "Good morning, Mr. Black." She served herself a plate of fruit, fussing over which piece of melon she wanted, before continuing. "I was a bit surprised to see that you'd already left this morning." There was an unstated "without me" at the end of that sentence, but if Pansy thought to throw Rigel off, she should have been more direct. Communicating without speaking was one of her and Archie's specialties. "I've always been an early riser," she said. "You weren't there when I left?" "I see," Pansy said. "And just what about the early morning do you find so agreeable?" Would it be worth my while to rise early as well? "I find the general lack of noise to be appealing," Rigel said, pretending not to notice Pansy's stiffening in offence as she paused to finish her milk before continuing. "It allows one to understand the few things they do hear more clearly. I wake early to avoid people, but I would make an exception for you because I would like to better understand you." Truly, the second half of Rigel's statement might also be interpreted as a desire to have more intimate conversation, away from prying eyes and distractions, but she thought that, between their young age and Pansy's good sense, she was unlikely to be misunderstood. "Perhaps I will be afforded the opportunity to see for myself," she demurred, offering a small smile to show that Rigel had escaped her irritation for the time being. Her statement was so neutral that it couldn't have meant anything, but Rigel chose to interpret it as a maybe. Whether or not Pansy would rise early with her tomorrow didn't matter. Pansy had gotten what she wanted, an explanation and an invitation, if not an apology. Rigel wondered if she could expect such manoeuvring every time Pansy was miffed at her. The blonde certainly seemed to be enjoying herself, smug satisfaction radiating from her every gesture. Rigel inwardly berated herself for forgetting that, as they had made a point of formally introducing themselves and then dropping those formalities. It would be expected that she escort Pansy to the next meal they had together. She could only be glad Pansy hadn't taken her slip as a personal snub. At 35 minutes until the end of breakfast, Slytherin House rose as one and retreated to the dungeons, startling a few first-year Hufflepuffs on their way out of the hall. Their head of house was already present when they arrived. He stood tall and unmoving in the middle of the common room as the students crowded in and filled the edges of the room. The first years kept together in a group by one of the study tables, shifting uncertainly as an oppressive weight settled over the room. When the silence had just begun to stretch from expectant to uncomfortable, he spoke. "For those of you who do not know." He looked toward their group of 11-year-olds, and Rigel found herself riveted against her will. He had a gaze that sprang like a trap if you were foolish enough to let his eyes catch yours. "I am the potions master, Severus Snape, your head of house. I apologize for my absence last night. I was unavoidably detained, as will happen at times. Nevertheless." He began to turn in a circle as he spoke, including everyone in the room in his regard. "As the new term begins, you will be expected to remember, or, in the case of our newest members, discover, what it means to be a Slytherin. To some of you, whose forebearers walked these dungeons, it means tradition, and to others it simply means unqualified acceptance. But for all of you, Slytherin means a chance to carve the contours of your future and forge your destiny as you see fit. As your head of house, it is my duty to assist you in furthering the ambitions that secured your place here in this room. For 7 years, your goals are my goals. Your plans and dreams and schemes will become my own motivations, and as long as you dwell herein, I pledge to assist you in realizing all your endeavors." He paused for a moment to let his words, incredible as they were, sink in before continuing. "In that vein, if at any time you require assistance, simply seek a portrait of Salazar Slytherin, and he will find me post-haste. He gestured to a picture of a dark-haired, green-eyed man hanging above the main fireplace. Rigel observed her head of house as he spoke, searching for the telltale signs. Yes, there in the fireproof robes, and there in the close-cut fingernails, and even there in the slight flaring of the nostrils as his nose prepared to inventory the scents in the room. This was a potions master. She absorbed his body language, proud and stiff. He looked more like a general appraising his ranks than any teacher she'd ever imagined. When he turned to directly face the first years, Rigel noted that he was more menacing in person than he had seemed on paper, with his hawk-like features and looming presence, and yet his words were much kinder. In his articles he spent as much time tossing acerbic comments at his incompetent contemporaries as he did presenting his revolutionary findings and brilliant deductions. She'd already steeled herself against immediate hostility merely because of who Sirius was, but Snape seemed not to have even noticed her. "In Slytherin House we stick together because a lone snake is no match for a lion, an eagle, or, yes, even a badger. We draw strength from our solidarity, our connections, and any other resources that become available." He paused to smirk in a way that had most of the older students chuckling along darkly. There are very few rules in Slytherin that cannot be bent to some extent. One is the policy against in-house fighting. If you have a problem with a member of your house, settle it with words in private or wands over the holidays. In this school, as far as anyone else is concerned, my snakes do not turn their fangs on one another. Any other issues are considered on a case-by-case basis. When you have crossed a line, you will know it, and pray you have the intelligence not to make the same mistake twice. He bared his teeth in a parody of a grin, and Rigel vowed then and there to never get on his bad side. Snape gave them all a final dark-eyed stare. Satisfied his point had been received, indeed even Malfoy looked like he wanted to squirm, he turned on his heel and left. The vacuum left behind by his presence was such that it took several seconds after the common room wall slid closed for anyone to move. Finally, a prefect cleared his throat and said, "Your schedule should have been delivered to your dorms by now, and whoever has class nearest the charms classroom first is responsible for showing the new snakelets the way." Rigel met Pansy's gaze, and the blonde raised her eyebrow in a silent question. She took her time, mulling over her impressions as they walked toward their rooms, and finally decided that a shrug was the best reply she could give. Pansy smiled, as if she had expected such a reaction. "He's got presence," Pansy said. "Father tells me he's quite renowned as a potions master, and everyone says he's a good head of house." Not, who was walking behind them, snorted with incredulous amusement. "Everyone in Slytherin, maybe. The rest of the houses think he's a right bastard." Pansy frowned at his language, but merely said, "Who cares what they think? They're wrong." Rigel left them to argue about it, still processing her first encounter with her. Idle? Certainly not. If there was anything Severus Snape wasn't, it was worshipable. Her hero, perhaps. No, too childish. Her future mentor, she decided, with any luck at all. He was just as larger-than-life in person as she'd imagined. And despite his words about approaching him with their ambitions, there was something inaccessible about him. She couldn't imagine going up to him and demanding his attention, especially considering the last name she was borrowing. And her real last name, for that matter. She'd just have to work twice as hard and make him notice her.